if we are seeing a decreasing in the funds available for social services, then we can expect naturally that we're going to have a more unhealthy population, poorly educated human capital or human resources, and lower prospects for development and growth. Think carefully about that. If we have increasing targeted expenditure on social services, then we are likely to have healthy, well-educated human resources, increasing prospects for development and economic growth. Hello everyone. My name is Colette from Conversations with Colette, your YouTube channel. I say your YouTube channel because the channel is as successful as the subscribers that we have coming on board. And I was absolutely delighted this week to receive a couple of calls, one from one of my former managers, a top manager at Cable & Wireless, recommending someone to be interviewed, and another one from someone who has an interest to be interviewed on the channel. Somebody else as well made contact with a family member to say that he has been following and he noticed that we haven't done an interview in a week or so. So I'm very happy to get the feedback, and this is a quick update on my study. Why is it important? Because we're looking at governance and fiscal management. So I'm providing a background as to what governance has been in Jamaica since independence, and then we will move forward to look at a global context of governance. Now, what is debt? Debt is the amount of money that the country owes. This is measured quantitatively, usually employing national statistical data, examined by level of accumulation and trends, often presented as total debt, external debt, domestic debt, and debt to GDP ratios. Now, what are some of the governance factors that have contributed to Jamaica's indebtedness? Unconstrained borrowing. And you can look at the changes in dollar value of debt term on term from 1957 to present. We have made some improvements, but we still have a long way to go. Another factor that has contributed to Jamaica's indebtedness is arbitrary gross fixed capital formation, mainly for legacy projects over growth enhancing projects. What do I mean by legacy projects? Projects that prime ministers and leaders can attach to their name in terms of their posterity. They want to be remembered for having initiated and completed different projects, irrespective of whether or not the project really leads to economic growth. Gross fixed capital formation measures the net increase in fixed capital. I'm going to shorten it by referring to it now as GFCF. So gross fixed capital formation, or GFCF, includes spending on land improvements, fences, ditches, drains, and so on. So some of the GFCF is important, but listen carefully. Plant and machinery, equipment purchases, the construction of roads, railways, private residential dwellings, and commercial and industrial buildings. It also looks at disposal of fixed assets. This is taken away from the total increase in fixed assets in terms of GFCF. Now, if we are to look at GFCF as a percentage of GDP across decades, averaged out from 1960 to 1969, it was 27.7% of GDP. We ranked 7 out of 76 countries. 70 to 79, 21.6% of GDP. We ranked 67 out of 113 countries. 1980 to 1989, 20.1% of GDP, ranking 96 out of 153 countries worldwide. 1990 to 1999, 26.9, 37 out of 181 countries. And 2000 to 2008, 20 out of 177 countries. And this is from the World Bank 2011, page 51, extracted from table 1.9. Now, we ran a regression test, and a regression model showed that there was a statistically significant association between Jamaica's domestic debt to GDP and GFCF from 1960 to 2010. Another factor that contributed significantly to Jamaica's indebtedness across administrations was repeatedly bypassing parliamentary controls. Government guarantees, more than 300, were signed and authorized between 1962 and 2010. Deferred financing helped to conceal the true debt obligation. Arbitrary social service expenditure For example, on the Rose Project, it was ranked by the World Bank as moderately unsatisfactory. The CAP, 390 million spent, 2 students were certified. Wasteful expenditure on energy, US 6.8 million, US 2.8 million spent, and yet we had not really become energy efficient in Jamaica. Profligacy in agriculture, for example, Spring Plains and the SCJ Sugar Company of Jamaica debts. Misuse of capital development funds, funds for capital projects used for recurrent and constituency expenditure. Air Jamaica, exponential increase in debt due to delayed divestment and loans. What is the extent of Jamaica's indebtedness and how has this affected expenditure on social services? Total public debt as at March 31, 2013 was 1.88 trillion. By September 2014, it was 2.047 trillion. Debt to GDP, 149.4% in 2013, one of the highest worldwide. What about trends in the debt structure? Domestic debt increased from 28% in 1990 to 75% by 2002, with interest as high as 49%. External debt decreased from 101% in 1990 to 47.3% by 2002. By 2010, domestic debt was 68% and external debt 62%. Domestic debt is really debt owed to locals, and external debt is debt owed to foreigners, usually in foreign currency. Even if the debt is owed in foreign currency and a local entity is holding that debt, we are going to be recognizing that as external debt. All right? What are the components of Jamaica's public debt? You have total public debt, and we see a peak in 1985 of well over 200% of GDP. We have change in public debt year on year. We have total external debt. So what are the components of Jamaica's debt? And what have been the components of Jamaica's debt from 1960 to 2010? You have total public debt, and that increased to a peak of over 200% in the 1980s. We looked at changes in public debt year on year. We looked at total external debt. That increased. We had two major peaks, again in the 1980s, well over 150%, and then in the 1990s, well over 170%. And you have total domestic debt. Changes in social service allocation with public debt in millions of Jamaican dollars. We looked at that because we wanted to see how indebtedness was affecting social services. We looked at recurrent expenditure budgets as a percentage of total expenditure budget. We looked at recurrent health budget as a percentage of total expenditure budget. And we looked at recurrent national security budget as a percentage of total expenditure budget. And guess what? Every time the debt increased significantly, the expenditure on social services fell. I created a model to demonstrate the interrelationships between social services and public debt, having discovered that. So when we look at social services, or the SS needs I refer to it as, you have expenditure for recurring social services, for the operations of ministries, departments, and agencies, and you have the capital social service expenditure for infrastructural development of schools, hospitals, etc. And that is affected by, or it affects, the government total expenditure budget for all ministries, departments, and agencies, including debt service. So we can see that increasing debt service obligation reduces funds for social services. Decreasing debt service obligation increases funds available for social services. So if we are seeing a decreasing in the funds available for social services, then we can expect naturally that we're going to have a more unhealthy population, poorly educated human capital or human resources, and lower prospects for development and growth. Think carefully about that. If we have increasing targeted expenditure on social services, then we are likely to have healthy, well-educated human resources, increasing prospects for development and economic growth. We also ran a regression model to test this, and it showed that there was a statistically significant association between allocation to health services and total public debt to GDP in Jamaica from 1962 to 2010. There was also a significant and strong correlation between all forms of public debt as a percentage of GDP in Jamaica and allocation to health as a percentage of total recurrent expenditure from 1960 to 2010. This suggests, ladies and gentlemen, that as debt to GDP levels increased, allocation to health was likely to decrease, and we saw that happening. How does Jamaica's public debt and economic performance compare with those of Barbados and Singapore? Over the period that we looked at, from 1960 to 2010, Jamaica's public debt on average was 89.47%. For Barbados, it was 47.21%, and Singapore, 69.22%. Debt to GDP in 2010 for Jamaica was 130%. Barbados 97%, Singapore 99%. External debt, 2010, Jamaica was greater than 60%, Barbados less than 50%, and Singapore's was insignificant. Now it means that they owe less in foreign exchange than Jamaica does. The challenge we have that Barbados does not have, although their debt to GDP has increased over the last few years, is that we owe a significant portion of our debt in foreign currency. We are not generating the foreign currency in terms of balance of payments because we are importing more than we are exporting. The other problem we have is a constantly depreciating dollar. So as the value of the Jamaican dollar declines, the amount of the external debt that we owe increases and external debt to GDP balloons. Now let's look at comparative indicators prior to and post-independence for Jamaica, Barbados, and Singapore. Per capita GDP in current US dollars in 1960 for Jamaica was $752 per capita GDP. So per capita GDP for Jamaica in 1960, pay close attention, was $752. For Barbados, it was $761. For Singapore, it was $925. By 2010, 50 years later, per capita GDP for Jamaica was $5,274. For Barbados, $15,035. And for Singapore, $41,122. What have you noticed there? Exponential growth in per capita GDP, the total GDP divided by the population, in all of our comparator countries that received their independence round about the same time as we did. Average life expectancy, 1960 was 68 for Jamaica. By 2010, it was 73. For Barbados, it was 68. By 2010, same period, 77. For Singapore, 68. By 2010, 81. So a longer life expectancy for persons in Barbados and Singapore as compared to Jamaica. How about the exchange rate? In 1960, it was 77 Jamaican cents to $1 US. By 2010, it was 85.86. Now, it is over 140, fluctuating between 135 to 144. Barbados, 1960, 171 Barbadian dollar to $1 US. 2010, 2 to 1. Singapore, $3.06 in 1960. In 2010, $1.36. Debt to GDP, 23.6% in 1960 for Jamaica, 130% in 2010. 16.1% in 1960 for Barbados, 2010, 97%. 48.2% in 1960 for Singapore, 2010, 99%. And these pieces of data have been extracted from the World Bank and the National Statistical Offices of the countries. Now let's look at comparative economic performance, Jamaica, Barbados, and Singapore in terms of productivity. Barbados was significantly more productive comparatively in terms of GDP per person employed to Jamaica and also for Singapore. If we are to look at comparative economic performance between Jamaica, Barbados, and Singapore, we can see that Singapore has become significantly more productive in terms of GDP per person employed compared to both Jamaica and Barbados, with Barbados doing significantly better than Jamaica in terms of productivity levels. We have had multiple devaluation of currency, and this has added greatly to Jamaica's debt service burden. The Jamaican dollar was devalued 12,098% from 1975 to 2014. We have moved from 77 cents to $1 in 1960 to 85.86 mentioned earlier by 2010. How does Jamaica rank against the Barbados and Singapore in the area of governance? We did a global review and we looked at Transparency International and other reputable organizations. Transparency International reported Jamaica's ranking in transparency and good governance in 2010 as 87 out of 178. Barbados was 17, the lower the better, and Singapore was 1, with 3 out of 10 for corruption perception for Jamaica. 2010, Jamaica, Barbados, and Singapore were ranked 83, 15, and 5 respectively. Again, the lower the better, out of 176 countries globally. And in 2014, 85, 17, and 7 respectively, out of 174 countries. In terms of the world governance indicators, Jamaica's overall WGI ratings were also well below those of the two comparators in 2010, with political stability being the lowest ranked. A statistically significant association was observed between Jamaica's external debt to GDP and its WGI political stability ratings for the period 1996 to 2010. We did an evaluation of the responses that we got back from our interviews and surveys. Elite interviews, surveys, and global reports. We juxtaposed each of these side by side. In terms of participation, the elites rated the overall governance structure irrespective of political party. And out of a mean of 10, Jamaica was ranked 5.8. Effectiveness and efficiency, the elites gave an overall score of 3.9 out of 10. Following the rule of law, 5.4 out of 10. Accountability voice, 5.1 out of 10. They did not rate regulatory quality, nor did they rate political stability, nor control of corruption. They rated transparency, 5.2 out of 10, responsiveness, 5.4, consensus orientation, 4.94, and equity and inclusiveness, 4.6. You will recognize that significant numbers of these ratings were below 5 out of 10. For the general public's rating of the People's National Party, participation 5.6. The Jamaica Labour Party 5. Efficiency and inclusiveness, both parties got a 5. Following the rule of law, both parties fell under 5. Accountability, both parties fell under 5. Transparency, both parties fell under 5. Responsiveness, the People's National Party 5.2 out of 10, and the JLP 4.7 out of 10. Consensus orientation, equity and inclusiveness were also marginal. International ratings, Jamaica's ratings, WGI 62.8%, following the rule of law 37.44%, accountability 60.19%, regulatory quality 59.81%, political stability 32.08%, control of corruption 44.97%, transparency 87%. Voice and accountability captures perceptions of the extent to which a country's citizens are able to participate in selecting their government, as well as freedom of expressions, freedom of association, and a free media. Political stability and absence of violence or terrorism captures perceptions of the likelihood that the government will be destabilized or overthrown by unconstitutional or violent means, including politically motivated violence and terrorism. Government effectiveness, capturing perceptions of the quality of public services, the quality of the civil service, and the degree of its independence from political pressures, the quality of policy formulation and implementation, and the credibility of government's commitment to such policies. Regulatory quality captures perception of the ability of the government to formulate and implement sound policies and regulations that permit and promote private sector development. Rule of law really captures perception of the extent to which agents have confidence in and abide by the rules of society, and in particular the quality of contract enforcement, property rights, the police and the courts, as well as the likelihood of crime and violence. Control of corruption captures perception of the extent to which public power is exercised by private gain, including both petty and grand forms of corruption, as well as capture of the state by elites and private interests. It's important to establish that both Transparency International and the World Governance Indicators are really a summary of feedback received both from local and overseas respondents to the different questions that are posed. We are faced with a triple dilemma. As a result of governance decisions to embark on wasteful expenditure, there has been heavy borrowing, which led to exponential increases in Jamaica's public debt, and crowding out of the private sector as government borrowed heavily from external and domestic markets. Jamaica is much poorer than it should be. This was not purely the result of external factors, but a consequence of bad decisions. This can be fixed by improving the character of governance through careful attention to correcting the weaknesses highlighted in the findings of this study. Policy implication 1. Funding of social services. Like South Korea, a public-private partnership in education and training, the developmental universalist approach they call it, in Jamaica, can spur growth and reduce the need for debt financing. Policy implication 2. Social services, crime and capacity building. Policymakers must identify Jamaica's social service expenditure priorities, reduce the public debt, and better manage the cost and maturity profile of debt in order to sustainably balance the books while balancing people's lives. Given present constraints, Jamaica's social policy philosophy can be shaped by an assessment of the impact of changes in social service expenditure allocation on the long-term well-being of the most vulnerable. Short-term welfare assistance cannot drive growth or create financial independence. The nexus between governance, debt, literacy, skill levels, and crime must be evaluated. We need to look at the impact of non-communicable diseases on productivity. This can be addressed through effective public education that has started and strategic interventions, and the impact of these on development and sustained economic growth. Let's look at another policy implication: improving governance, controls, and sanctions. The main issues of governance identified related to lack of accountability, transparency, and adherence to the rule of law, as well as control of corruption. Recommendations: implement an efficient, clearly documented, and rigorous process of checks and balances with punitive sanctions for infringement. That last part is extremely important. Where there are no sanctions, there is not likely to be any change in behavior. There needs to be consequences. Conduct cost-benefit analyses for public sector projects or programs. Even with a contract commission, the OCG, the Integrity Commission, and the Auditor General's Department, cost overruns and nepotism have reportedly significantly increased debt service costs. The PAAC of Parliament must now be held accountable to periodically report to the nation on punitive sanctions applied to cauterize profligacy identified. The public must be vigilant. Let's talk about another policy implication: financing capital projects and programs. Different approaches have been taken by government wishing to expand fixed capital to drive development. Barbados did this through government savings supported by loans. The People's Republic of China used their regional development bank Asia Development Bank. Singapore uses CPF. The GOJ is encouraged to review these three approaches where government savings over a specific period can be earmarked to assist in funding targeted public sector projects. While a regional source such as the CDB, the Caribbean Development Bank, may also be engaged, especially now that we are impacted by the pandemic as a region, to co-fund capital projects with regional reach and impact. Let's look at another policy implication: determinants of 1, external debt, and 2, per capita GDP. So Jamaica's policymakers must now pay keen attention to the following: the statistically significant relationship between Jamaica's external public debt and its political stability rating. Crude birth rate, inflation rate, and exchange rate were deemed to be reasonable predictors of per capita GDP for Jamaica between 1960 to 2010. It is therefore reasonable to suggest that a more stable political environment with strong governance institutions can improve Jamaica's external debt, including the interest cost on debt and the debt to GDP ratios. While improvements in crude birth rate, number of live births per thousand, effective exchange rate management, which I think the Bank of Jamaica is doing a pretty good job of it, albeit they cannot control the level of depreciation and the value of the Jamaican dollar if we're not exporting more. And if demand keeps on increasing for the dollar, the price of the dollar is going to go up. So we're importing more and exporting less. That needs to be addressed. Reduction in inflation rates. Again, the Bank of Jamaica has done a pretty good job across administrations in that area. And greater productivity. All of these can improve Jamaica's per capita GDP. Another policy implication we need to look at is related to planning and debt management. Evaluate risks thoroughly and ensure that contingency plans are in place to mitigate their impact. Focus on the size, composition, and the structure of debt. Then devise policy measures to reduce the interest cost as well as the level of debt. Tobin 1963, the IMF in their debt sustainability analysis course that I covered, I pursued that course in 2014-2015, very useful course for persons who want to understand fiscal management and strategically coordinate monetary and fiscal policies. Exercise stringent fiscal discipline. It is more lasting than simply adjusting the primary surplus or targeting stabilization of the economy across the cycle. Increase effectiveness and efficiency of institutions to improve governance and fiscal management. Drastically reduce corruption. I'm going to repeat this one. Drastically reduce corruption, as observation of the rule of law enhances economic performance that is tested and proven. Here are some practical recommendations. The problems identified in this study can be addressed by recognizing and improving the channels through which governance impacts debt. Let's look at institutional capacity. Address the capacity of agents of government, the impact of rules and regulations and adherence thereto. Look at the chain of command and effectiveness and efficiency within those chains of command. Fiscal policy. How about automating information flow some more? Have a coordinating officer responsible for automating the information flow. And from time to time, let's do an EIA, an economic impact assessment on the changes in terms of fiscal policy. In terms of monetary policy, interest rate and foreign exchange management has to be tight. We must increase the NIR, and not simply in terms of borrowing via the window dressing that we receive from the IMF and other financial institutions, IFIs. Let's look at the ethical and moral aspect of management, of governance. Punitive action must be put in place. We must see more civil society activism. And of course, there needs to be impeachment legislation in place, not just for those who are at the top, but across the board in politics. Developmental issues. We need to ensure that we have industry-specific HR and infrastructure for the development of our human capital. Audit political parties consistently. Comes back to accountability in governance. Professionalize HR selection process for candidates and constituency offices, not just selecting somebody because they belong to a political party and we want to give them a job. In terms of the legislative and constitutional, use the Norman Manley Faculty of Law to train MPs in provisions of Erskine-Mays and the legislative procedures. Use the JIS and civics curriculum to sensitize citizens to their roles and responsibilities in the governance process. Social. Streamline welfare support using standardized qualifying criteria. The PATH program is useful, but it is not foolproof. Use the GIS free media slots for sensitization and reorientation of the public's approach to social service provisions and governance. How about applying the Singaporean approach, where you're really empowering persons to become independent of welfare? This study provides an in-depth historical examination of Jamaica's political economy since 1962. It adds to the body of literature on governance and macroeconomic management and will make a significant contribution to improving governance, fiscal discipline, and debt management in small developing countries like Jamaica, if the policy implications are acknowledged and recommendations accepted and implemented. These findings also provide those in governance with a better understanding of the perceptions of the respondents regarding their stewardship. The information can be used to build a social capital in order to engage the populace in more effectively reducing the country's debt to GDP and growing economy. I thank my research supervisor, Professor Anthony Clayton, lecturers, advisors, and examiners for the excellent guidance they have provided and the support. I thank my family for the time they sacrificed while I conducted this extensive island-wide survey, interview, and study. Ladies and gentlemen, we are happy that you have taken the time to come to Conversations with Colette, and in particular to listen to this presentation on governance and public debt management in Jamaica from independence to present. We can assure you that we will continue to bring you content that is relevant, not just in terms of your own development, but to widen your understanding as to the wider global environment. Thank you so much for choosing Conversations with Colette. Please remember to subscribe, like, share, and comment. Have a nice day.